Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Leslie Gordon, and I am the executive director of the Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum here in Midtown Atlanta. We are your home for history, culture, and art of the Jewish people. And please join us for many things. Our current exhibition is called History with Chutzpah and traces 250 years of history in Georgia and Alabama from Simon Nunez, who landed in 1733, all the way up through John Ossoff. So think about coming to see us for that. We have lots of arts and cultural programs on our YouTube and Vimeo channels. We are a leader in Holocaust education, both for teachers and students. And we welcome you anytime with either a phone call or on Sundays. So please think of joining us in person or virtually. I am thrilled to be able to partner with both the Jewish Genealogical Society, or Genealogical Society of Georgia, let me get that right, Jewish Genealogical Society of Georgia, and with the Atlanta Jews of Color Council. I'm super excited for this particular program, so let me turn it over right now to Victoria Rags.
Again, a warm welcome to everyone joining us from all over the country this afternoon. My name is Victoria Rags, and I'm the Executive Director of the Atlanta Jews of Color Council. We are a Jewish woman of color owned and led charity organization with a mission of advancing racial equity, affirmation, and empowerment across the South. It is our pleasure to co-sponsor this book discussion with the Bremen Museum. And now I'd like to introduce presenter Heggie Monsinger Freeman, founder of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Georgia.
I'd like to echo Leslie and Victoria's welcome. The Jewish Genealogical Society of Georgia is delighted to have you join us for today's webinar. If you have more questions about the Jewish Genealogical Society of Georgia, you can contact us from the Bremen Museum's genealogy page on their website. Now for a few technical details about today's webinar. Professor Liebman's handout with searchable links is posted in the chat. So if you want to download a copy or if you want to follow it as she speaks, then get that link from the chat. Professor Liebman has asked that you put your questions in the chat and she will answer them at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, so if you love it as much as I loved hearing her when she spoke at the International Genealogy Society Convention, you can tell your friends. It will be posted on the Bremen Museum's YouTube channel and also on Vimeo. It'll take about 2 weeks for it to get there. The Bremen Museum will send out a survey after this event by email about the program. It only takes a minute or two. It's really easy to fill out, but it makes a big difference to us because we learn what kind of programs appeal to our audience and helps us with our fundraising. So please help us with our future programming by completing this survey. And now let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Laura Arnold Leibman is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1995. She has been a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Panama and the University of Utrecht, Netherlands, a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford in England, and the Leon Levy Foundation Professor of Jewish Material Culture at Bard Graduate Center in New York. Her first book was The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects. Today, she'll talk to us about her second book, Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Jewish Family. So with no further ado, I give you Dr. Laura Leibman.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody to the presentation for today. I'm going to be sharing images. If you can't see the images for some reason, let me know because it will make it much sadder as a presentation. So I'm assuming if I don't see any cries for help, you're seeing them as we start. So although I'm going to be talking about Jews of color in early America, I'm actually going to start in the present, or at least the very near present. And I want to start with the Jewish community study in New York in 2011. And one of the things that was very important about this particular study was that it shifted the way that people were starting to ask demographic questions about American Jews. And part of the study pointed out that for many years, American Jews had been seen and characterized as a white ethno-religious group. But with this survey, they began to explore the multiracial character of the New York area Jewish community. And they did this by creating a classification for households that could include non-white members. So it wasn't that Jews of color hadn't existed before this, it's just people hadn't asked specifically about Jews and their racial background in surveys. So the households that could qualify for that particular non-white members could be if the respondents were Black, Hispanic, Asian, biracial, or if there were white respondents with more than one household member who was also either bi or multiracial. And the result of the survey was that 87,000 households in the larger New York area qualified as non-white in some respect, with over 161,000 Jews. So this was about 12% of New York Jewish households, or 10% total of the Jews in the New York area. This was then followed up later by the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, which has since been renamed, which really went back through a lot of the different surveys that had been done of American Jewish communities to think about what questions had people asked that would help give us a bigger picture across the United States, so not just in New York, about the diversity of American Jewish communities. And one of the things that they found was the only consistent thing was the lack of consistency of what people were asking. So instead of finding like perfect answers for everything, they discovered we kept on asking the question differently every time there was a survey, and this made it very difficult to sort of have a complete picture across the United States. But they did note that as part of this work, that for some communities, particularly on the West Coast, that the percent of Jews of color in communities in the United States was often much higher than in New York. So on the West Coast where I live, often it will be 25 to 25% of Jewish communities. And again, with this constant problem of what questions were people would ask was impacting the kind of data that we would get. So for me, this kind of survey and then the follow-up survey asking like, wait, how does the question we ask impact the data we get, helps me understand or think about how have we also made similar mistakes when thinking about data about American Jewish communities from the past? How have the very questions we've asked or not asked shaped the answers that we get or we expect about American Jewish communities? And it turns out I'm not the first person to ask these sorts of questions about the past. As will probably come to no surprise for Jews of color, rabbis of color have been asking these questions for a long time. Who were the ancestors that came before contemporary Jewish communities? And one of the leaders of these sorts of questions was a man named Rabbi Arnold Ford, who was originally from the West Indies, but lived in New York before going on to Ethiopia. And in one of his histories of his particular Jewish community, he identified 4 main paths in early America that fed to the diverse community that he then had in Harlem in the 1920s. And those were people who had come directly from Africa, already with Jewish identities, people who had come to the Americas largely because of the Inquisition, either to the Spanish West Indies or the Spanish colonies as crypto-Jews, and then people such as himself who had come from the British West Indies, and I'm going to particularly talk about Barbados, where he was from, as well as people from the Dutch West Indies, and he was particularly interested in Suriname. So just really important to point out, his is not the only Black-run synagogue in Harlem in the 1920s. There are about somewhere between 4 and 8 different congregations in Harlem at this time, again, with these very diverse communities of people who have these ancestries that go way back into early America. So I think it's really important, though, to ask, who is Rabbi Ford thinking about when he talks about Jews of color, because it may be different than what we're talking about when they're doing that survey later today. He was primarily interested in Jews with African ancestry as opposed to people who are Hispanic Jews or Asian Jews. And he was also interested in people who either self-identified as Black or who were assigned to a racial category other than white. So as opposed to people who had some African ancestors but primarily functioned as white in society, he was interested in people who had been disenfranchised because of their African ancestry, but also who had brought forth different traditions because of those ancestors. Very importantly, when he started to give his histories of his community, he was met with a lot of distrust by white Jews at the time. So just as one small example of this, when there was a talk in 1931 on Long Island Jewish Center, and the very white Rabbi Norman Salit declared that the Black synagogues of Harlem, such as Rabbi Ford's, were, quote, based on a mixture of superstition and ignorance that has nothing to do with Judaism. And this was something that would get repeated again and again, not just by white Jews in the sort of general community at the time, but also by white academics who were involved either in anthropology or in the history of American Judaism. So a lot of backlash against the historiography that he was putting forward, as well as the communities themselves. What I want to talk about today is how more recent research, including my own research, has actually supported a lot of what Rabbi Ford said. So I didn't start out to try and prove him right or wrong, but I think really important that the more we know about early American Jews, particularly Jews of color, the more it turns out that Rabbi Ford's statements about the histories are actually quite correct and reflect this longer tradition of histories of Jews of color throughout early America. So I'm going to be talking today both about Rabbi Ford's historiography of where people are coming from, but also bring in more recent research, including the work that went into the book that just came out called Once We Were Slaves, that is about a multiracial Jewish family that began their lives enslaved in Barbados and ended up some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. So really part of this larger discussion of like all the years of research that went into finding this and all the evidence that I found of where one could find the genealogical information that supported both the history that I was writing, but also the histories that had already been established over 100 years earlier by Rabbi Ford. So as I mentioned, Rabbi Ford had these 4 different places that he was interested in terms of the early genealogies of Jews of color in the Americas. And I'm going to take them kind of out of order and start with the place that the family I was working on was starting, which was in Barbados, because I think it's really instructive in terms of how some of the diversity came into American Jewish communities. So for those who aren't quite sure where Barbados is, it's on the southeastern part of the Caribbean. And I'm going to focus not on some of the labor camps or plantations all around the island, but rather in this main port of Bridgetown, because that's both where the family and the multiracial family that I've been working on lived, as well as where Rabbi Ford was born. And they both grew up in and around this area around Swan Street, near the Nida Israel Synagogue and the Methodist Church and the early Anglican Church that was primarily run by people of color. One of the really important things that came out of the research that I did on my family was to try and think about not just the lines of people who were considered halakhically or legally Jewish, but what was the impact of the other people within the family on the descendants. So I was looking at 2 siblings, Sarah Brandon and Isaac Lopez Brandon, and their father, a Sephardic Jew named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. But I was also very interested in their mother, a woman named Sarah Esther Gill, or sometimes Sarah Esther Lopez, who, like her children and all of her brothers and her mother and her grandmother, had been born enslaved to a Sephardic family in Bridgetown, and that was the Lopez family, who were friends with Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. So through my research, I was able to trace back the siblings' ancestry, not just to their mother, but to their grandmother and their great-grandmother. And this became very important to me, not only because it clarified who the extended members of their family were through their mother's father, but also it became clear that through their mother, they were related to the most important woman in early Barbadian history. So their aunt is a woman named Anne Jordan Gill, who's later referred to as Sarah Ann Gill, and she is known as being the earliest female national hero of Barbados. And the reason why she's a national hero of Barbados is because when the Methodist Church took over on the island, it was disbanded by the Anglicans because it allowed both people of color and women to preach, and that was considered something that was going to destroy the fabric of society. And so the Anglicans came and they tore down the synagogue, the church, and the next day they came back and they picked up all the rubble and threw it into the ocean. And then the white Methodists left the island and fled to someplace safer. After the white Methodists left, Anne Jordan Gill took over that congregation and made it what it is today, which is a very female-led, diverse congregation, which was the starting place for many of the civil rights for both free and enslaved people of color on the island. So for me, this information that this family was related, not just to members of the synagogue, but right next door to it, this Methodist congregation, became very important because it turned out there was a lot of movement back and forth between these two congregations. So we have a number of dialogues between the two leaders of the congregations, as well as this particular family, through her brother, ends up fighting for civil rights in the synagogue. So this really helped me understand a lot of what Rabbi Ford was talking about. All of these different stars around the streets are places where different people who had at least one African ancestor and also ties to the Jewish community live. So different people with some kind of multiracial Jewish identity. And Rabbi Ford was part of these communities and part of this Methodist church of the people who would go back and forth. So really important for understanding his arguments about why it was that even if his ancestors had not been part of the synagogue itself, that they were still part of this larger Jewish African community going on in Bridgetown at the time. After the siblings came of age, when Isaac was about 18 or 19 years old, they decided that they were tired of living at the edges of the Jewish community and that they actually wanted to become legally members of the Jewish community. And in order to do that, they had to leave Barbados. That Barbados at this particular time very rarely would do conversions. And so the siblings went south to a place called Suriname. And although they look grown up here, she was only about 11 or 12 at the time, and he's just shy of 20. So I think it's worth asking, why go to Suriname to convert? Because most of us today, if we had to convert to Judaism, wouldn't necessarily pick Suriname as the place to go. Why was it so important for this particular pair of people? Well, one of the reasons had to do not just with where they landed, this main port of Paramaribo, but a place further south down the Suriname River, and a place called here Savannah, or often referred to as Yoden Savannah or Jews Savannah. So Jews Savannah was, in the colonial period, the first and for a long time the only semi-autonomous Jewish town in the Americas. It was a place that was run by Jews for Jews, and where Jews made up a lot of the rules of how things would work. Somewhat contingent upon the colonial authorities, but they were left to their own devices a lot of the time. So we see them putting, for example, their synagogue at the highest point on the hills, just like the Torah tells them to. In addition, the entire plan was laid out according to the way you would lay out the tribes around the tabernacle. And we even see that the plantations that were surrounding this particular town of Yoden Savannah were often owned by other Jews. So we see the names of the people who owned it are very commonly Sephardic ones, and they will name the different plantations with this sort of hope that it will bring about this kind of New Jerusalem biblical era. So we have like the Fight of Jacob is the name of one of the plantations. Diligence is the name of another one. Again, these sort of dreams, the hope, the idea that it's going to be this kind of New Jerusalem era. And part of that was that they had to reckon with what was the biblical tradition regarding slavery. And one of the books that was very important for this in Yoden Savannah and Suriname more generally was a book called Sefer Brit Yitzhak, which gave prayers from both circumcising and converting enslaved peoples. And so as a result of this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 moils in early Suriname, which I have to say, even in Portland, Oregon today, I don't think we have that many moils, and we have 45,000 Jews. It's a huge number of moils. So again, really trying to follow those laws according to the Bible. So that may help us understand in part why Rabbi Ford was so interested in Suriname as this particular place for the origins of multiracial Jews and Jews of color in early America. And in fact, we know that in addition to the people who were converted and for hundreds of years by the time Rabbi Ford is talking about have been legally part of the Jewish community who have African ancestry. In addition, we know that in Suriname, the idea of Jewish identity was incredibly important among several of the Maroon communities. So Maroon communities are communities of people who either themselves or their ancestors had been enslaved and they escaped from slavery and then formed their own communities, usually at a distance from the white population. So a number of different Maroon communities link themselves to Jewish tradition, including, for example, rules about what kind of food you could eat. But that identity of the Maroon communities of linking themselves to Jews within Suriname also was something which gets at the second aspect or the third aspect that Rabbi Ford was talking about origins for Jews and Jewish heritage in early America that was tied to African communities. And that was people who came directly from Africa with a Jewish identity. So we know from a number of early narratives by enslaved people, including very famously Alado Equiano's slave narrative from 1789, that the very regions that people were coming from Suriname and to Barbados from were areas which in the oral tradition in those areas, people already had Jewish identities. And those traditions continue on to today. Today, there are millions of people, for example, in the Yoruba Igbo area today that identify as Jewish through an African line, as opposed to through converting to in a community run by white Jews. So really important that we see in a number of early slave narratives from this time period that there are people in this particular part of Africa that have these ties to a Jewish identity. And for me, this helps us understand a little bit about Rabbi Ford's own sense of his own genealogy. And when he thinks back to both his father and his mother, he's very interested in what tribes they came from or were descended from in Africa. And in particular, they are linked back to that area that I was talking about in Western Africa. Oops, now it's going to be angry at me that I went backwards. There we go. So he's really interested in how that African lineage continues on through the oral tradition. So while I was only for the family, I was looking at only able to go back 4 generations, and I don't know what part of Africa they were from in terms of written records. We do know from DNA evidence from their descendants that they were also from that same area. The enslaved members of the family were originally from that same part of Africa. So by the time that the people I am working on, Sarah and Isaac, come to Suriname, that area around Yoden Savannah has really fallen into disrepair, and they instead have decided to go back upriver to that area around Paramaribo, that main port. And it turns out if they had come to Paramaribo in the 1780s as opposed to 18 teens, they would have had a really different opportunity of where they could have converted. They would have had not one, but 3 different congregations where they could convert. So I'm going to talk first about these two, the one where they did convert, the kind of rival congregation, then I'll come to this other congregation last. So the first 2 congregations are the Portuguese congregation, which is where they decide to convert. At this particular time, that makes sense because their father is a Portuguese Jew, but it's also makes sense because being a Portuguese Jew was considered much more, I don't know if fancy is the right word, but much more higher status than being an Ashkenazi Jew. And we know this even from the words that were used in the Portuguese synagogue. So the word that you would use to refer to an Ashkenazi Jew was this would also could be used to mean a maid or a servant. So really sort of thinking of the Ashkenazi Jews as lower class. And indeed, if somebody from this congregation married somebody from this congregation, he would be demoted and lose some of his status within the congregation. However, at both of these congregations, one of the really important things that was happening in Suriname was this incredible diversity of people who were part of the Jewish community, whether they were Ashkenazi or Sephardic. So somewhere between 10 and 50% of this community were either perceived of as being Jews of color or had at least one African ancestor. So the reason why there's some variation here is because the way that race functioned in Suriname was different from, say, in Barbados. So in Barbados, if you had even one African ancestor, you were a person of color, you were that race for all of your life. You could not change it. Not so in Suriname. In Suriname, if you had 7 out of your 8 great grandparents were from Europe, you could either be white or you could be designated a person of color. So if your parents married, you were white. If they did not, you were a person of color. If they married after you were born, your race would change from being a person of color to being white. So that's how we get this difference between the people who are understood as being people of color versus the people who have partial African ancestry, even if they're being understood as white in the community. And we see this impacting the way that they're writing their marriage contracts within Suriname. So this is a marriage contract by Ismail Jadou and Hannah D'Amatos. I'm sorry, I'm looking around my screen to see if I can see the rest of it. And from 1729, from 2 people who were both considered Jews of color, and they start to change the marriage contracts to indicate that racial information. And the way that they did that was by referring to them in the marriage contract as emancipated Jews. So they don't add something that says they're Cushites or some other way that they would have referred in the Bible and that we see in a lot of other early Jewish American documents, but instead are saying they're emancipated. They had ancestors who were once enslaved. They're still Jews. They're not a different race, but they're emancipated Jews. And this designation will haunt the people who are in this community. If you fall into this 10%, that would impact you in a variety of different ways. So if you were considered a Jew of color, you, for example, might not be allowed to be buried except for in the swampy section of the cemetery. You would not be allowed to be called up to the Torah. You could not vote in the synagogue. You could only sit in the bad seats in the synagogue. So a lot of these prejudices being built into how people are referred to in the marriage contracts. And I think this helps us understand in part why many Jews of color do not end up staying in early Suriname, but end up spreading around the Atlantic world, just as Rabbi Ford had been talking about. Really important that within this community, the Jews of color do not take these prejudices against them lightly. Instead, we see petitions not only to the European Jewish-run congregations, but also to the colonial authorities, really getting at the nuances of colonial law of why it should be illegal for them to be discriminated against in this way. And part of what was really interesting for me, and I talk about a fair amount in my book, is it's not just the men who are doing this. We have at least 6 different women of color from this early congregation who are leading these protests against the oppression from the white Jewish community. So as I mentioned, this migration northward and upward out of Suriname, both into the Caribbean and into places like New York and Philadelphia, becomes really important for the spreading of that diverse community into other parts of the Americas. And we see it, for example, in the end of the 18th century, when a man named David Nasi, who's a member of the Surinamese community, comes north to Philadelphia and takes part in some of the treatments against one of the yellow fever epidemics, and brings with him 2 formerly enslaved people who were members of the Jewish community who help nurse the people in Philadelphia back to health during the yellow fever epidemic. So again, we see people coming north, both with their expertise from dealing with yellow fever, but in particular, Nasi and Matthias Nasi, David Nasi and Matthias Nasi, the man who had been enslaved to the Jewish community, bring educational information about how to treat yellow fever that was both from the enslaved community in Suriname. So David Nasi talks specifically about this, as well as the Native American community in Suriname. So we see that really important. It's not just they're coming north because they have to, but they're bringing really important knowledge that's been passed down through the generations through these African Jewish lines. This continues on into the 20th century. This is a very famous family in early Suriname, where we have a very multiracial family where the mother is wearing the kodomisi, which is the distinctive Surinamese African garment and headscarf. It's a sign of pride during this time period. And we see that her sort of balancing her Jewish identity with her African identity at the same time. And we have both records from the 19th century of women of color coming up from Suriname to Shearith, Israel, and being part of that congregation, as well as other members of this family, such as Irma Miriam Lopez Cardoso, who ends up, who is related to the people pictured here, who comes up during the 20th century and is the wife of the Hazan of Shearith, Israel. It's a little hard to see her, but she's also wearing the same kodomisi outfit in an early picture of her as a child in Suriname. So in terms of the family that I work on, they left Suriname and go back to Barbados, and then on to London and on to New York. So Isaac ends up going to Barbados. He gets involved in the civil rights disputes after he becomes officially Jewish. He fights in order for Jews and himself to have the right to vote. He ends up getting kicked out of the Barbadian synagogue because of the Anglican community, and ends up coming up to New York and Philadelphia, where he is accepted, despite a large amount of racism in early New York, into as a full voting member of Shearith, Israel. His sister goes to London, where she meets a Jew from New York whom she marries at Bevis Marks, the Portuguese congregation. And that particular marriage then leads her again back to New York when she's very shortly after she's married. She is pregnant at the time when she's traveling back, which I don't know if you've heard descriptions of like those travels across the ocean on those ships, but it sounds awful anytime, let alone when you're pregnant. She survives it and goes on to have not 1, but 10 children before she dies at the age of around 30. She has 2 sets of twins, and 9 of her 10 children survive to adulthood. So she ends up living very close to her in-laws' house. This is where the synagogue's located. And then her brother, after he's had all these travails in Barbados, comes up to just first Philadelphia with their mother, and then into New York, and sets up house right next door to them, becomes her husband's business partner, and he marries her husband's sister. So the families become intertwined very heavily. And those connections really help him to become established, both in terms of being allowed to vote in the congregation, as well as being allowed to become a voting member of the United States, something which often was denied to people with African ancestry during this time period. So within the US records, both of them are referred to as white, in spite of the fact that they're living in and amongst many other people from Barbados who know about their early ancestry. So for whatever reasons, the New York community seems to think Jewishness trumps African ancestry. It's a time period where there's a lot of fluidity across different places in the United States in terms of how race is being defined. However, whenever Isaac goes back to Barbados on business, he's becomes a gentleman of color in Barbados, and he comes back to New York, he's white again. So again, very much race being defined differently in different places impacts the kinds of privileges that they're able to have in the different locations. So I was really interested in many ways about some of the travels that happened in the next generation as well, particularly from Sarah's sons, who don't stay in New York, but spread out all around the world. In addition to going to China, they're involved in the gold rush, they're in the Mexican-American War, a couple of them settle along the Texas border, a couple of them try and overthrow the government in Nicaragua. And this location of a variety of where they settle was very interesting to me because coincidentally, it's the place where we see many of the early crypto-Jewish communities in what was at that point early on New Spain. So what would have been Mexico later becomes the United States. So really interesting that her sons settle in these particular locations, places that we know that Jews both were involved in crypto-Jewish communities where there are a number of slaves coming in working for Jews in silver mining towns throughout colonial Mexico, particularly in those northern regions where the brothers are living, where a number of people are being hauled up before the Inquisition. And the brothers themselves who settle in that Texas region have several illegitimate children who are members of, go back and forth across the border, who have both Spanish and Mexican and indigenous ancestry, as well as their own African and British and Jewish lineages coming together. Today, this continues to be a place, this region in the southwestern United States continues to be a place where we see these revivals. This is sort of a coincidence that she has a title similar to my book, but here's an example of a woman who, along with her daughter and grandchildren, traced back their lineages to these crypto-Jewish communities and then converted halakhically to Judaism and are part of this religious revival that's going on in the southwestern United States. So for me, this was very interesting in that the family itself sort of tied into what Rabbi Ford was talking about in that fourth main place that he was seeing the diversity of his community coming from, namely that legacy of the Inquisition, both in the Spanish West Indies and the Spanish colonies, and the descendants of crypto-Jews, particularly, and he's particularly interested in people who have both that lineage and are connected to people who were brought over enslaved to New Spain. So this brings me then forward to the 1920s, when people start to make the maps of Manhattan and are starting to think about the ethnic diversity of Manhattan. And by this point, Sarah and Isaac's descendants have lost all understanding of their early ancestors' period of having been enslaved. This is Sarah's granddaughter who's living in Morningside Heights and so close to where Rabbi Ford is living. And they've shared this through their lines, this involvement in this Methodist church and synagogue dialogue that was going on in Barbados. Yet even the way that the maps are being laid out at this time, trying to separate out those two communities. So the parts in red here are places where Jews are seen as living, places in gray are places where African Americans are living. And you notice it's as if those two communities couldn't be together, even though we know there are all these African American synagogues at the time in Harlem, in this area where there's no red in evidence, right? So Jews separate in the minds. And I think this really correlates in many ways to Blanche's own understanding of her own genealogy as somehow always been Sephardic, always free, never with anybody who'd been enslaved, because were she to have imagined that her grandmother had begun her life enslaved, by the 1920s, the racial way race is functioning in the United States has changed, and it's been codified in the census such that there's something similar to what it had been in early Barbados, that one drop rule. So for Blanche to imagine her grandmother had African ancestry is for Blanche to imagine she also has African ancestry, which is for Blanche to realize, according to the census, she is not white, which she never checks that box in the census. She only designates herself as white for the rest of her life. So I think, again, really part of this moment in history where, as interested as people are in genealogy, stories such as that as Blanche's families fall out of the history, and where we get this pushback from Jews who are starting to see the ethnic landscape similar to the map maker as being completely separate from people of African descent. So I just want to end by talking about some commonalities then between what I have been thinking about in my research in terms of Jews of color and multiracial Jews in early America and the diversity of Jews today in the United States. And one thing that I think is really important is this issue of multiple geographies. There's so many different places that people are coming from that feed into the diversity of American Judaism. There's not just one place and one time. It's not just first there's the Spanish Jews, then there's the German Jews, then there's the Russian Jews, right? In each time period, we're having this diversity of geographies contributing to American genealogies. The second one is how diverse those genealogies themselves are. So really thinking about the different ways that people come to Judaism, either coming from Africa with ancestry that is considered Jewish, or being forced to convert, or wanting to convert themselves. Third, these are super complex histories for any one of these people that I think really hard to disentangle, but also really important for us to start to understand. Fourth, really during this early time period, we see the Jews of color grappling with Jew-on-Jew racism and exclusion, and that being a pattern which persists certainly into Rabbi Ford's day and into the contemporary era. But at the same time, that we see a lot of resistance and resilience on the part of people from these early communities. So I really want to hearken back, not just to Isaac and his own struggles for Jewish civil rights and for his own civil rights, but also those 6 women in Suriname who are using the legal system in order to fight back against oppression within the Jewish community. So I'm going to shift over. I'm going to stop sharing so I can share something else. Let's see if I can come back over here, share a different screen. I'm going to go turn to the handout just really quickly. So for people who are interested in finding out some of these multiracial lineages in their own families, where you know that your ancestors might have come from one of these places, I really wanted to give you some resources that were crucial for my own research, resources that we often don't talk about in American Jewish history that ended up being just crucial for understanding the legacies of the people that I've talked about today. So some of these have to do with slavery and manumission resources, but I also wanted to include some of the early synagogue records, particularly how to access ones from Suriname, as well as the early censuses from Suriname, which provide really crucial information for tracking down ancestors in early Suriname, as well as racial information about them. If you have any ancestors that are on these Surinamese lists, reach out to me, because I have gone to the originals of the census and have copies of all the details that are, otherwise you have to go to London and get them, about the different family members. And they're very exhaustive information about the different families. And I've also put all the information from early newspapers, particularly again, both the Surinamese newspapers, which are really, really helpful, and which are free online, as well as the entire collection of Jewish newspapers, which is searchable online, and which includes information both from Latin America and from North America and the Caribbean and other locations. So I'm hoping people will find some of those resources helpful as they go forward and are tracing their own family lines as well. Thank you so much for coming and listening to the talk. I would love to hear questions from people.
I think there are some questions in the chat,
Sure.
mostly lots of compliments, but go ahead and people can put their questions in the chat.
But I will go through and see, let me go backwards and see if we can, maybe I'll start at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start at the bottom and sort of work my way back up. The first question is from Suzanne. Did Jewish slave owners free their slaves after 7 years? Typically, no. So I think really important that I think there's a lot of hope on the part of Jews today that maybe Jews were kinder somehow in terms of how they were treating people who were enslaved. And I would say let go of that idea that certainly in Suriname, there's a huge, it's just a horrible, horrible slave system more generally. And we don't have any evidence to suggest that. I would say also just like in general, you know, yeah, I would say no. So, you know, I always feel like we want to aim a little bit higher. It's sort of like you don't, that in some sense, like the ideal is not enslaving people as opposed to being nicer for enslaving people. Have you seen any records or diaries of family observances of holidays like Passover Seders? That is actually more common from later time periods. So I know there have been some really interesting recent publications by Jews of color on different Seder traditions. And I haven't seen anything like that earlier on. The stuff that I've seen from holidays and Passover Seders earlier on, more is from white Jewish families. There's a diary by Emma Mordecai that talks about it during the Civil War. And I would say in general, again, this sort of goes back to some of the issues that I was talking about where Jews often are part of the oppressive class as opposed to identifying with, even at Passover, as identifying earlier. However, I'm seeing Rabbi Lowenthal saying I use a haroset recipe from Suriname. Yeah, I have at various points posted, and I talked about in a book from long ago. I have a book on early America called Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism, and I talk about a lot about food in early America and talk about, for example, haroset recipes from Suriname. So Suriname is really interesting in terms of both the way that they adapted haroset recipes. They also adapted cassava to use instead of matzah when they didn't have enough access to matzah. But yes, I can also, if people want to email me, I'll put my email in the, oops, I need to change it, not being post to everybody, liebman@reed.edu. I'm happy to email you the haroset recipes that I have too from early America. I'm seeing, right, is there a connection between the island of Curacao and Savannah? Any connection with the Suriname group? So Curacao is sort of interesting in many ways. So there is a fantastic early cookbook from Curacao, from the Jewish community, that includes a lot of recipes that are very much blended Caribbean and Jewish recipes. So also, if you're interested in any of that, email me and I'm happy to send you the information on that as well. But there are a lot of connections between Curacao and Suriname's Jewish communities. Suriname isn't as inclusive in terms of who it converts. And so during this time period, Suriname has a much, much larger diverse community than Curacao. Curacao, they're about the same size in terms of absolute number of Jews, but in terms of the Jews of color, Suriname is really the key place in early America. I'm going to go back a little bit farther since I feel like I'm just dealing with the most recent questions. Going past all of the information on closed captioning, which I'm not dealing with.
No, yeah.
Somebody asked, what is a crypto Jew? Which is a great question. So crypto Jews are people who are descendants of forced converts to Judaism. So both either during some of the earlier waves in Spain, or people, they were given the option, you could leave or you can convert. Many people then went to Portugal in order to escape, and then were forced to convert, or they would have to leave their children behind. So that actually, that's why Portugal ends up being so important for the Jewish community going forward. So descendants of those people who were forced to convert, in some instances, will keep Jewish traditions in secret. So crypto-Jews refers to those people keeping those traditions in secret, often up until today. So you'll see people in the Southwest who still maintain some of those secret traditions and will pass along some of the legacies of being Jewish. And there are a number of people who have traced their genealogies back all the way to the Inquisition records. So really good question. Are there current Jewish or philo-Jewish groups who exist outside of the standard Jewish community, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, etc.? Yes. So I think really important that just as we saw that there had been this third congregation in early Suriname named Dar HaYeshurim, it was that yellow star in Paramaribo, where they set up a separate congregation where they could have full rights and not be sort of under the sway and under the oppression of the European Jews. Similarly, in later time periods, we see plenty of Jews of color creating their own communities that are completely separate from, so like the Black Israelites would be an example, or so the number of different communities where people are setting up just separate congregations because they are tired of the European Jews controlling who gets to make decisions about Judaism. So yes, I think really important that that is an ongoing thing. Part of what I wanted to get at here was, I think those have often been dismissed in American Jewish history as being not really Jewish. Those are a part of Christianity or something like that. And I really think it's important for us to think about the ways in which by their own testimony in terms of where people in the congregations came from, there's a lot of evidence to support it. So really important to think about those questions about who gets to ask who is a legitimate Jew, determine or shape who is accepted into communities. Are there resources that show how the multiracial Jewish community was affected by the Holocaust? There are. So there's actually a member of the Nazi family who was an artist who was captured during the Holocaust and was interned. And he actually has a lot of artwork about the Holocaust, so he's from a Surinamese Jewish family that's multiracial. So he actually does have a lot of these intersections in his art between the Holocaust and race. So he's a really good example of somebody who happened to be in Europe and got caught up in the Holocaust and is really thinking about that tradition. Again, if you want to know more, feel free to email me. I'm going back down. More about things. Oh, somebody asked, I missed what she said about not having that many X, even in Portland today. Moils, people who do ritual circumcisions, that I was like, whoa, there's so many moils in early Suriname, partially because it's an enormous community and has very good Jewish infrastructure, but also because, again, there is this policy of inclusion there. Yes, so somebody noted the yellow fever. Lillian says the yellow fever epidemic was one of the worst pandemics ever, and we could learn from the people who are brave enough to help these people ill from this right now. Yes, I have to say, as I was writing this book and sort of finishing it up, the pandemic had just hit, and it really changed the way I thought about yellow fever. So I do write about yellow fever in the Once We Were Slaves book, but I have other work that I've published that's coming out as articles on the yellow fever epidemics. And I think it's a really good example of how our own experiences really can help us understand things in the past differently. So, I think we do our best as historians to understand the past, but each of us brings different experiences and different knowledge to those records about the past. And so, you know, my understanding of what's going on in terms of about race in the past is obviously limited by my own experiences as well. And so I do hope that, like, going forward, there'll be other people who will come and look at these records and see different things that I, with my limited lens, am not able to see. So I think we always do our best, right? But I think the yellow fever epidemic is a good example of all of us having that moment where we realize, oh, I could see how once you've lived through an epidemic, you would understand how incredibly hard it was for the people at the time. And one of the things that was so interesting to me about the yellow fever epidemic and early Philadelphia in particular was how we saw a lot of the same in New York, a lot of the same issues coming up around race and ethnicity that we see today. So both a lot of the anti-Semitism kept on coming up, but also that particularly in Philadelphia, the Black community was very hard hit and ended up doing a lot of the work that the white community was afraid to do, and really was on the front lines a lot of the time, and really fought very hard after the sort of first pandemic died down to get some recognition for the way that they had suffered, in particular for the benefit of the larger Philadelphia. And I do think that going back and seeing some of those things in the past can be like really important for us to realize, like, how going forward we continue to like have these systemic problems that impact how each of us experiences even major crises like epidemics that impact everybody, but not everybody the same.
I'm gonna just
Yeah.
put in as we approach 3 o'clock.
Sure. Sorry.
No. I would love it if you would stay for a few minutes.
Sure.
To answer some more questions, but I just want to remind everybody before they start leaving that your books are available on Amazon. The recording of this webinar will be available on the Bremen's YouTube channel and on Vimeo. Please contact us on the genealogy page of the Bremen website. There's an email address there so that we know you want a copy of the recording. And don't forget that survey at the end. It's really important for us to be able to offer programs like this, that you fill out that survey. So thank you all for coming. And now I'm going to let Laura answer questions until you quit asking them.
Well, how about I'll look for about 3 more questions.
Okay.
I see a great somebody from I'm Barbadian, and all those surnames I have as DNA matches in the Ashkenazi DNA, which is Sephardi. My grandma refused to eat meat or fish. We did. My mother's mother. I need those details. Yeah. So I think here is an example of like, definitely reach out to me again. I'll put my email address again. I, at some point, went through and looked for as much information as I could find about all those early people who had connections both to the Jewish community and to either the enslaved community or the free people of color community. So I have lots of like archival information that people, if you're looking for ancestors with feet in both worlds from Barbados, contact me, because I have tons of stuff that's very hard to get. I'm happy to share it with people. And same again, as I want to emphasize, like if you have ancestors from Suriname and you're looking for that 1811 census data, reach out to me, because I have thousands of photographs of the census data that is just mind-boggling, with like so compelling in terms of what it tells us about people during that time period, of who's living in which household, what jobs they're doing, could they sign their names, like just really, really interesting information that really, I wish it were digitized, and I hope at some point it will be. Have you compared the history of Sephardi and Jews of color in New Orleans? Oh, thank you for bringing this up. Okay, I attended a Jewish history tour in NOLA and learned that philanthropist Jules Toro traveled from Rhode Island and settled in Jamaica before settling in New Orleans, and he has multiracial descendants. Yes, so one, I do talk about that a little bit in my Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism book, some of his descendants, and because they were really important for the work I was doing at that point. But I also want to let people know the American Jewish Historical Society is having their conference in New Orleans this May, and there are going to be a lot of panels by and about Jews of color at that conference. And so definitely, if you're interested, reach out to me. It's much more Southern history centered and a lot of information about the Caribbean. So I'm hoping I put that out there. If you're interested in the New Orleans, let me know, because I'm happy to give you information about what will happen with that conference. Lots of other things, but feel free to email me. Again, my email is liebman@reed.edu. Happy to share things that I have in terms of resources, as well as answer more specific questions for people.
Laura, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. As you go through the chat, I'm sure you can see that it's hard to find the questions for all the compliments, which is a wonderful situation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We look forward to sharing more interesting stories about genealogy and history from the Jewish Genealogical Society of Georgia, from the Jews of Color Council in Atlanta, and from the Bremen Museum, who makes it all possible. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.